I think one of the ideas that immediately caught my attention when I started getting into the ICO review was that people kept talking about token economics. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm an economist. What's token economics? And then from learning from different people in the space, and also, Bitcoiners included, I started to realize that incentive structures are really, really important to a blockchain's value proposition. So it's important to understand, essentially, will agents in the system operate in a way that strengthens the system, or do they have a profit motive to undermine the system or to cheat?
That is Chloe White, and this is episode 28 of the Blockchain Pro podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 26 of the Blockchain Pro podcast. I'm Adriana, and today's guest is Chloe White. Chloe is an economist with a keen interest in token economics. She works at the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources of the Australian Federal Government and is the blockchain lead driving the National Blockchain Roadmap signposts implementation. This podcast is not about the roadmap, but Chloe's interesting personal journey discovering Bitcoin in the crypto world and reconciling that journey with her passion for public service. Let's get to know Chloe. Hi, Chloe.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. Welcome to the Blockchain Pro podcast.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
I'm glad you're here. Let's jump right in. It's this Monday morning, it's rainy in Sydney. So let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
And talk about how you began your professional life.
My professional life. Well, I'm in that generation of millennials who began their career in the thick of the global financial crisis. So around 2008, 2009, I had a job at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Sydney, working in management accounting, which was not one of my greater passions in life, but it was a really good introduction to the workforce and in a corporate professional sense. Very, very different than, my high school jobs that I had, being a checkout chick at Kmart and that sort of thing. But it was a really stressful time. I think a lot of people have heard those stories about you show up to the office in the morning and a whole row of desks have been cleared out and you just never see people again. And it really was like that. And when the crisis was peaking, my role was to sit and answer phone calls and respond to emails and letters from people who had lost their investments through liquidation. And so I was hearing real stories about, people who they lost their superannuation or they lost their child's, college fund kind of deal. And those stories really stuck with me. It had a really big impact on me. So I decided after that I actually really wanted to focus more on economics. My undergraduate degree was economics finance, and I knew that accounting wasn't really my calling. So I left PricewaterhouseCoopers and I moved overseas and I did a master's degree, and that was great because I was able to combine my interest in economics and finance with policy as well. And I made a decision toward the end of my stay there that I really wanted to make a contribution to public policy. And so I ended up then, after a couple of years, moving to Canberra and joining the public service. And I've been doing that for about 8 or 9 years now.
Wow. Before we get into that part of your career, where did you do your master's? Which city did you go to?
I was living in a really beautiful university town called Maastricht in the Netherlands. So it's really close to the German and Belgian border. And it's where the EU was founded with the Maastricht Treaty.
Oh, there you go. Did you get to go to the EU Parliament and things like that?
We did do a trip to Brussels where we got to visit a lot of European Union institutions and international organizations, and that was quite cool. I did a lot of traveling while I was there, which I was really glad to be able to do because I'd always had a travel bug growing up. So it was a wonderful but very busy couple of years of studying and traveling and making friends and learning a lot, and I got a lot out of it.
Oh, that's wonderful. And traveling over there is so easy.
It's so nice. Like, you can just travel an entire country from one end to the other on a train without really having to schedule anything too much. It's very convenient.
Yeah, it's very freeing.
Yeah, I think so. Have you done a lot of travel in Europe?
Not a lot, but in 2018, I went to the World Cup in Russia. And then I stayed back and did a little bit of traveling. So it was fun.
That sounds very adventurous. I haven't been to Russia.
Russia is awesome.
Cool.
It's this secret world that not a lot of people visit, but it's quite amazing.
That's cool. You'll have to tell me some more stories about that sometime.
I will. All right. So you went to live in Canberra, and how was that like?
I enjoyed Canberra a lot more than I expected to. I sort of went in there thinking, oh, I might stick this out for a year or two. And I ended up staying there for about 6 or more years. The time just flew by. I got to work with some really smart people and learned a lot and worked on a lot of really complex and important policy issues. So I think I picked some issues that were quite challenging, and that meant that there was a lot of disruption in the early years of my career because if you remember around that time, we were kind of flipping back and forth between a number of different prime ministers on the Labor and the Liberal side. So the consequence of those kind of changes for the public service is that departments get shuffled around a lot. So I got moved around quite a bit. I started out in the Department of Climate Change, working on carbon market policy. And then I ended up going to Melbourne for a while and doing a secondment at an independent authority that was advising the government on emissions caps. And that was really, really challenging, but a great experience as well. And then we got mogged. So a mog is when one department is absorbed by another. So it's like a takeover. So we got taken over by the Department of Industry. And then I got invited by the Department of Foreign Affairs to go and be their kind of economic advisor on their UN negotiations. So I went and did that for a couple of years. Then I spent a brief period of time working in an agricultural economics research bureau doing modeling on beef trade, which was a totally different experience altogether. And then I ended up at the Treasury, and that was where I spent the most time. And while I was at the Treasury, I also was able to make the transition from Canberra to Sydney, which is where I'm based now.
Thank goodness you're back here.
It's good to be back. I spent basically all of my 20s away, and at some point I felt like it was time to come home and be with my family. And it's been so lovely in the last, how long has it been? The last couple of years, reconnecting with old friends and making new friends as well.
That's always good. Can we talk about like creating economic policy, what that entails, without getting into the detail of the policies itself, but how is that like in your day-to-day job? What do you do for the people who have an interest in that but doesn't know how it works?
Yeah, totally. And I'm always happy to talk to people who have an interest in policy design or policy advising. But how things work in the public service is basically exactly how it was described to me in my university textbook. There's something called the policy cycle or the policy process. And the idea essentially is that you have to start by defining what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And that's a lot harder than it sounds. And it's really important to get that right. And once you've clearly articulated what is the problem that you're trying to address, then you have to uncover all of the options, and you do an options analysis. at some point as well, you would rope in stakeholders who might have expertise to contribute or who might be affected by some of the options. And doing stakeholder engagement is a really important part of the process. And not just at one point, but throughout the process, because if you are actually enacting a law or designing regulation, then when you release the draft legislation, you also want to provide people an opportunity to look at that and comment on that as well. So there's a lot of consultation that goes on. And the whole time that you're doing this as well, you're liaising with the actual decision makers, who are the elected officials, to notify them about what options you've uncovered, what feedback you're getting from stakeholders, and they are kind of the ultimate decision maker on, you know, whether they want to proceed and how they want to proceed and what they'd like to take to Parliament. And then once something has passed Parliament, then you go through the process of designing all of the regulations or the implementation of the policy. So the implementation phase is often overlooked, but that can be really challenging as well, because oftentimes the agency or the team that's implementing the policy is not the team that designed it. So that can create some challenges. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the reviews. So in best practice, what you would do at some point in time is say, okay, well, this policy has now been in effect for X months or years. Are we actually solving the problem that we identified at the beginning? How are we performing? Do we need to make any tweaks? So that idea of the policy cycle or policy process was introduced to me, you know, in textbook form, but it's served me very well in practice.
Okay, it's good to know that the textbook still, reflects the reality.
Well, actually, there's a book that I really like to recommend on this topic. I think the author's name is John Kingdon, but it's a pretty short book. It's not like one of those huge 800-page textbooks. If you can find a copy of it, I think that it provides a very realistic explanation of how policy is made in the real world, and particularly this idea that you have a policy window. So you might have a policy proposal that's really sensible and has a huge amount of merit, but if you are lobbying on that idea at the wrong time, maybe it's the wrong time in a political cycle, or maybe it's just the wrong time in terms of the issues that society wants to prioritize. Having a good idea doesn't guarantee you success. So timing and influence are really important in the process as well.
So it's like, with any idea that you have, if you're forming a business of some sort, you need to respect its cycle, right? It's the same for policies. That's very interesting. There you go. I learned something new today. That's awesome. I don't know very much about how government works on purpose.
Really complicated, and there are a lot of people in Parliament and in government who they develop subject matter expertise where their subject matter is on how different parts of government run, because it gets quite technical. There are so many rules around how many days you need to introduce things, and I'm still learning new things all the time about how government works, and I'm involved on a pretty deep level. So I definitely have a lot of empathy for anyone who feels like it's a bit of a mystery.
There you go. Okay, so how did you discover crypto? How did that come about?
So I was first told about crypto by a friend who got into Bitcoin relatively early, and he was very passionate about it. And honestly, find me one person who understands Bitcoin who isn't obsessed with it. It's an amazing phenomenon that this whole universe exists. But at the time, I just thought he was crazy, and I had no idea what he was talking about.
That is a lot of people's first reaction, right?
That's right. So I was definitely one of those people who had to have multiple touch points and exposures before I started to decide that it was worth really investigating. So it wasn't until I was working at the Treasury in their macroeconomic team that I started to follow more on a daily basis what was happening in the markets. I was in a team that did macro financial analysis, which basically means looking at the intersect between what happens in the macroeconomy and how that affects the financial markets, and how you can read financial markets and capital markets to understand the macroeconomy. And at the time that we had the huge crypto boom in late 2017, it was mainstream news and a lot of people were talking about it at that time. And so this macro financial team that I was part of was tracking the price, and that was a really exciting time because people were having so many debates about, what is this asset? Is it worth anything? Does it have inherent value? What does it mean that it's attracted so much capital? So I then started to get a little bit more interested in wanting to learn about it. And then when I moved from Canberra to Sydney, I was asked by the Treasury if I wanted to move into the financial market side of things. And Sydney being, the capital market capital, there are a lot of people in the Treasury Sydney office who do focus on financial market issues. And they asked me to run the ICO review. And I didn't know anything about ICOs at that time. I hadn't really heard about the concept of ICOs. I'd heard about altcoins from just following the crypto boom, but I took it on because I just thought, yeah, this is an opportunity for me to basically develop knowledge in a whole new area and just to try something different. So I took it on, and then that was when I really started to fall down the rabbit hole.
And what an amazing rabbit hole this is.
I think that it was positive karma for me in my life that this job fell into my lap, because it's taken over my life and I love it.
That's great. So how does the Bitcoin, do you consider yourself a Bitcoiner?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
So how does a Bitcoiner reconcile working to promote blockchain? We've had this conversation before. I just would like you to enlighten other people, our listeners.
I love discussing this with you, Adriana, and I can sort of track how, for both of us, I think our views have continued to shift and evolve over time. And for me personally, I think one of the ideas that immediately caught my attention when I started getting into the ICO review was that people kept talking about token economics. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm an economist. What's token economics? And then from learning from different people in the space, and also, Bitcoiners included, I started to realize that incentive structures are really, really important to a blockchain's value proposition. So it's important to understand, essentially, will agents in the system operate in a way that strengthens the system, or do they have a profit motive to undermine the system or to cheat? And I think that one really important concept to work with is the blockchain trilemma. So, that triangle where you have security, speed, and decentralization.
Mm-hmm.
And basically just to be really aware of the trade-offs that are involved in different blockchain designs. There are some people who would say, well, if you're using a closed or a permissioned blockchain, then that works against the ethos of blockchain and decentralization and that kind of thing. And then, there are others who would say, well, if your blockchain is slow, you're not going to be able to compete with Visa and MasterCard, and it's just clunky, MySpace era technology. So there's all these different perspectives, and people draw different conclusions about what protocols or what networks they like, based on the trade-offs they prefer to make in the blockchain trilemma. But I think the conclusion for me is, as long as you're being clear and honest about what those trade-offs are, then at least people know what they're working with, and they can go in with their eyes open, understanding that there is a fit for purpose solution. And so I don't agree with people who say, Bitcoin was great because it paved the way, but now it's redundant. And, I don't agree with that. I think Bitcoin is fit for purpose technology. its use case is not to buy coffee and pizza. It's kind of, the way that I think about it is, if you're trying to catch a mouse, would you use the mouse trap or would you use an army tank? Bitcoin's like an army tank. It's not going to help you trap the mouse, but that doesn't mean that the tank doesn't have any use case, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very secure network, and I think that the fact that it does develop at a slower pace is actually a feature, not a bug. There is a more cautious approach taken with Bitcoin Core, which I think is very appropriate. I understand the frustration of people in the community who would like development to move more quickly, but I think what really has to be prioritized is the security of the network, because if there is some catastrophic failure, that's going to shake people's confidence in this entire industry, in all of crypto. It's not just a problem for Bitcoin. And to the extent that Bitcoin operates like a kind of index for the rest of the system, then it has to be protected.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It has to be protected, and people have this urgency, to get things done fast, but that does not apply to everything. You're absolutely right. So, okay, we covered post-grad travels, we covered treasury. Now you're the lead for the blockchain roadmap. Weren't you the right person for this job? It's like it was built for you.
I really appreciate you saying that, and I have been so touched by everyone's support. And yeah, it's a wonderful feeling to take on a challenging role like this and know that there are a lot of people cheering me on. So I'm really glad to be in the role. I'm enjoying it, and I think now is the right time to be growing out the blockchain industry more than ever. We need to be communicating to the general public and to people across sectors what value blockchain technology can deliver for them. And one thing that I've learned since coming into this role is, certainly beauty is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to blockchain. And I think that there is a legitimate reason why people approach this with a certain level of skepticism. And there's value in asking those hard questions and being a bit of a cynic. So I know sometimes, people kind of tease me that I like to ask the hard questions, but that's how we all learn, right? We need to be having those hard conversations, like I was saying, about if we're going to embrace free market competition and let everybody, decide what trade-offs they value and build the protocol or the system that they value, then we also need to be able to query exactly how that's working and understand it. So I think we need to be asking the hard questions, but the reason for that is not because, we're trying to tear each other down. It's because the more that we ourselves understand what is going on in the industry, the better a job we'll be able to do when we go out and try and educate people who are outside of the community. And what I see happening in Australia is some people are building solutions where most of the innovation or most of what's clever about their solution has very little to do with actually hashing loads of data to a blockchain somewhere. So so more and more, I think that what we label as blockchain is oftentimes just a really clever, innovative combination of data packets and cryptography. So I think that we need to be a little bit more imaginative when we think about what blockchain is and how we use it, because I think a couple of years ago, the way people were talking about blockchain was, you take all of this data, you hash it all to the chain, and then there was a response to that, which was, well, but what about privacy and GDPR, and how do you reconcile all of these things? So I think that's the kind of thinking that is outdated now, that we need to move away from. It's less about how do we make all of these chunks of data immutable and transparent and auditable? It's how do we use blockchains in a really efficient way so that we're leveraging their value, but that we're not creating more problems for down the track. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, and I hope that in a year's time, the roadmap would be able to answer that question. I mean, how
Exactly.
do we do this in Australia? How do we use this technology to, make better transactions between industries and, better transactions for citizens and all of that? That's really exciting.
Yes, absolutely. And for anyone who hasn't seen the roadmap, on page 13, it sets out our 12 signposts. And we do have a couple of signposts that are related to, researching, what are those international applications of blockchain that we can learn from in Australia, and how can we in Australia collaborate with people internationally. So I'm really excited to keep growing out all of the activities that we're doing under the umbrella of the roadmap. Obviously, the working groups are the top priority, and I think most people would have heard by now that that's the direction that we want to take this year. But we're also progressing other signposts as well. It's not all about the working groups, so it'll continue to expand over time.
That's brilliant. So what has been your favorite thing so far about your new role?
I have enjoyed so many things. I'm part of a new team now. I'm seconded to the Department of Industry. So while technically this is my second time in industry, it looks very different than how it looked when I worked there in 2013 or whenever that was. And so I'm really glad that I've landed in a team of really smart and lovely people. And I'm also really enjoying that I get to chat every day to people in the industry. It's wonderful hearing the projects that people are working on, the kind of issues that they're thinking about, the questions that they have, the ideas that they come up with. I really enjoy being able to share that with people and to help connect other people together as well. I think one of the fantastic opportunities that I have in this role is I get a bit of a bird's eye view of the sector because I talk to so many different people. So I find that really rewarding. I mean, the other thing I appreciate is having the opportunity to educate people within government and outside government. I think within government, people are actually really curious to understand more about blockchain, and outside government, people are really curious to understand, how government works. I get a lot of questions about how government works and how policy works, and so I love being able to share my knowledge with different people in different circles, and to learn things from them too. So I know I just said 3 things and you asked me for 1, but
no, that's okay. There's no limit.
It's such a fun job. I just can't choose.
I have this view of government jobs as this boring thing, and you painting a completely different, picture, which is really, really interesting. So hopefully more people, that want to affect change will get into government, because it looks like that's what it takes.
Well, sometimes I wish it was more boring because there's so much going on in a given day. And there are so many external factors that affect a public servant during their day, because you just don't know what's going to be the priority for your minister or the prime minister on a given day, and depending on where the parliament is sitting on that day as well. You might get a last minute request for an urgent brief, or so there's all kinds of different ways in which uncertainty and ambiguity can interrupt your day, and you'll end up working on something completely different than what you planned in the morning. So it can be quite unpredictable, and that, I think a lot of people find that really stimulating. On the other hand, the challenge is that if you're really setting aside time to do deep work and then you get interrupted, that can be a bit tricky to manage as well. But so it's certainly not a boring job, at least not in my experience.
No, I'm happy to hear that, 100%. So we're getting to the pointy end. What advice would you have for, those people who are thinking about getting into working with government? Are there pathways? How does that work?
Absolutely. One thing is, if you are a recent graduate, you can apply for a graduate program. So I think every government department has a graduate intake every year. So if you go to the careers page of any of the government departments or regulators, you should be able to find information about graduate intake. If you're more established in your career, there are still plenty of opportunities. If you go to APS jobs, you can actually sign up for alerts so that anytime a department that you're interested in is advertising a role that's more for intermediate or senior career professionals, you can have kind of like a weekly update with all of those opportunities. Recruitment in the APS is quite transparent. It's common practice that roles will be publicly advertised, just like mine was. So there's always a job going somewhere in the government. I would say those are the first two places to look.
That's great. All right. How do you explain Bitcoin to those in your life that are not tech savvy?
Actually, I got a call from my dad a few days ago asking me what blockchain is, and I felt a huge amount of pressure to explain it in the fewest words possible because he's not a very patient person, and he doesn't have any kind of computer science background. So what I ended up saying to him is that it's like an Excel spreadsheet with a lot of cryptography.
Oh, there you go. Happy with that succinct explanation?
Yeah, he was. It's probably the quickest overview of blockchain that I've ever given anybody. So that's kind of, I think that's absolute most simple, bare bones way that you can kind of capture the essence of it for people. And I think if we all do our jobs properly at some point in the future, blockchain will be really a boring concept like that, right? Because all of the mystery will be removed and people will be able to see it clearly for what it is, which doesn't mean that it's not exciting and innovative and value adding. But I think if we can make it a bit less mysterious, then people will be more willing to incorporate it into their tech stack and engage and experiment with the tech.
Plus, I think we don't have to understand how all the little things work in order to use it and get the big picture, right? Like we use computers, but we don't understand how the chips work. We use cars, but we don't understand how the motor works. It's the same.
I go back and forth on this. I sometimes feel like if you try and tell people that in order to understand blockchain, they're going to have to learn about consensus algorithms and things, that that's not a very accessible way to introduce them. On the other hand, I sometimes feel like if you do take some time up front to investigate those things, it serves you really well into the future because you'll have an easier time assessing alternatives, right? So the piece of advice that I give to people is if you're trying to learn about blockchain, learn about Bitcoin, start with Bitcoin. I think if you really understand Bitcoin, then from there you will have a point of reference and you can continue to come back to that anchor when then someone talks to you about a different protocol. I think Bitcoin is the easiest blockchain to learn about, and it makes sense to me to start there. And even for people who are already in the blockchain industry, if you don't understand Bitcoin, then maybe go and spend some time looking into it, because I think there are a lot of lessons that can still be learned from Bitcoin that I think people maybe don't recognize or have overlooked for various reasons. But as I said, I think Bitcoin remains the anchor for everybody else in the space. So it's important to pay it the respect that it deserves.
Yeah, I once went to a conference that was very blockchain heavy, but not very Bitcoin heavy. Do you know what I mean? One of those that let's renegade Bitcoin. And I sat on the panel and I said exactly that. If you want to understand the space, you have to learn Bitcoin first. That's how it all started, right? And it has, all the components to make you understand. And because its function is money, everybody understands how that works. sort of. So it's a little bit easier to grasp the concepts. I love that.
Yes, I completely agree.
Thank you so much for being here. I learned so much about how government works, and I am sure that this will help lots of people. It's quite entertaining. I love speaking to you. You know that.
Oh, I always enjoy when we catch up. And if anyone wants to ask me more questions about government or other things, then they can feel free to contact me.
I will add your Twitter and LinkedIn to the descriptions.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Chloe.
Thank you.
And that was the wonderful Chloe White. If you have questions for Chloe or want to connect, I've added links to her Twitter and LinkedIn profiles to the description. Make sure to drop her a line. Hope you enjoyed this chat. If you have suggestions, you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn as well. Feel free to drop me a line anytime. I wish you a wonderful, productive week, no matter where you are. Stay healthy, be safe, and I'll see you at the next block. Bye.